Hello and welcome to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today we'll be looking at the remaining part of the Lifeforms promotional campaign, starting with the final few transmissions. With the main bulk of the 3D Headspace Tour out of the way, a few shows were broadcast after the release of Lifeforms. One of these took place on the 25th of May 94, transmitted to Glastonbury-based Radio Avalon, known for its dance and ambient-based nighttime broadcasting. Another took place on the 28th of May, transmitted to Manchester-based Piccadilly Radio. The final known broadcast from the tour took place on the 7th of June, transmitted to the BBC's national Welsh station, BBC Wales. As with all the other unknown broadcast dates on the tour, the shows here were probably fairly similar to things like the Rome broadcast. There are, however, a handful of bootlegs of unknown origin. The fact that the shows to promote Lifeforms were called the 3D Headspace Tour is taken for granted now, but there was a time back in the murky days of the comparatively early internet when the phrase wasn't used very much. In fact, for a time it only really turned up in reference to a few bootlegs. Two of the bootlegs are unidentified in terms of where and when they were recorded. A third is a tape from Florida broadcast on WMNF in Tampa. What's interesting is that there's no reference to US dates anywhere in the promotional paperwork surrounding the album other than the transmission to the kitchen in New York later in the year. With ISDN technology still being somewhat new, it seems the possibilities to do a full world tour were still limited, but the Florida bootleg does suggest a way around this. The band sent a 60-minute cassette of the kind of material found on a transmission to the radio station. The presenter describes the show as a specially designed programme for WMNF from the future sound of London. There are about 40 or 50 radio stations participating in this tour. Each programme for each radio station is unique, so what you hear here is going to be different from anywhere else. This is quite a revelation. There could be 40 other unheard shows out there. The actual differences between these shows remains to be heard, although it's likely they're variations or repeats on things we've already heard. Indeed, the first side of the Florida tape is literally Kiss FM Transmission 5 Part 6, and the second side is Kiss FM Transmission 6 Part 5. How's that for symmetry? Given that none of these shows were promoted as being live gigs, and the crossover in listeners would be next to non-existent, the repeating of material is forgivable. The bootleg described simply as 3D Headspace Tour has no known location. There's no intro or outro announcements from a radio presenter, meaning this could easily be one of the UK shows, Belfast, Weir FM, Chiltonstoke, Radio Avalon, Piccadilly or Wales. It could also have come from another tape sent to the US. It's quite likely to be the latter if the Florida tape is anything to go by, as this show is identical to Kiss FM Transmission 6 Part 4. The final of the shows goes under the name Radiotrance Mix. It's possible that Radiotrance was the name of a dance music show on which an ISDN transmission was broadcast. This one, at least, is a definite broadcast as part of the 3D Headspace Tour, as a set list appears in the most important moments of a life book with the heading half-hour radio broadcast. Other than the inclusion of Vertical Pig, the first time since '93, the show is pretty much what you'd expect, similar kind of tracks and environments as the Essential Mix and the Rome broadcast. As I say, it remains unknown exactly where this was broadcast, but it was almost certainly one of the aforementioned British radio stations. None of these shows have been released to the Podroom, but all three bootlegs can be found on YouTube. I've popped a tracklist for the Radiotrance mix in the comments below. The 3D Headspace Tour, however, wasn't the only way the album was promoted. Indeed, at this point, the FSOL broadcast system was definitely taking on the ultra-media approach, with the release of the Lifeforms VHS. Release date 31st of May 1994. I just bought a CD single in my local indie, and on the way out I glanced at the VHS section. I almost certainly did a double take as I spotted a video of Lifeforms, my favourite Future Sound of London album. I would probably have been about 14, and FSOL's music carried a mystery that other music didn't. The fact that there was a video really excited me, and I ran to the car where my parents were waiting for me, begged to borrow some money, and ran straight back to the shop hoping it hadn't been sold. Obviously I was thinking there are a large number of FSOL fans just waiting for me to leave the store. I looked at the back cover. 2 tracks, Lifeforms AV and Lifeforms Path. I assumed AV meant album version, or could it have meant audio visual, and Path meant a version from the Paths 1 to 7 single. 2 music videos, what would they be like? I was expecting wide natural vistas, deserts, rainforests, maybe my perceived story of what was going on in the Lifeforms booklet with Spikey breaking out of his scientific lab. So the actual content surprised me a little. Despite the titles, no full version of the path or track Lifeforms is on the soundtrack. Instead, the two videos are each made up of excerpts of two tracks as well as several linking environments. Lifeforms AV opens with environments from Lifeforms Path 1 and Path 5 and the closing environment of Among Myselves, before a couple of minutes of Dead Skin Cells fade in. Illflower, Cascade and Vertical Pig environments follow before a still unreleased track rounds out the section. Eastern instrumentation and vocals meet with bright synths and a chunky analogue beat. The track could very easily have been included on either the Lifeforms album or single comfortably. One day we may be lucky enough to get a title for the track. I've asked, but no answer is forthcoming. The soundtrack to Lifeforms AV was first broadcast on the final Kiss FM transmission and featured on most of the 3D Headspace Tour shows too, possibly as a way to include a huge amount of Lifeforms material in a short space of time. The second track, Lifeforms Path, opens with a brief environment from the transmissions before heading into 2 minutes of Vertical Pig, somewhat sped up to make it an even more intense piece. Lifeform Ends, Little Brother, Slowed Down Vit and Illflower environments come and go before the second unreleased track appears in the form of an excerpt from Deep Into Your Subconscious I Slide. The full track would be released on Astralworks compilation Excursions in Ambience, the Third Dimension, around the same period. More transmission exclusive environments close the video on a sinister note. Of course, the music isn't really the purpose of the video, what about the visuals? The Lifeforms VHS is the band's first real attempt at taking the Ultramedia broadcast system they were becoming into visual territory. Much was made of the money pumped into the band's visual side. Indeed, more of their Virgin advance seems to have been spent on graphics equipment than their already comfortable music gear. Shortly after signing to the label, Brian and Garry embarked on a series of interviews with Music Technology magazine. The series only lasted 2 volumes, but gave an idea of how early on they were looking at combining the various forms of media. We'd like to be developing that side at the same rate that we're developing our sound, so I think what we're going to be doing here is knocking through the wall when the guy next door goes and set up a U-matic edit suite. Our images should be as sophisticated as our music. Garry remained positive at the time, especially about the equipment they were beginning to be able to use. For the first time we got access to the video gear we've been after and looking towards for the last couple of years, which is silicon graphics, the stuff Jurassic Park was shot on, which I think is going to become a very, very creative medium in the next 2 years. Of course, this being 1994, a music video budget, even with access to silicon graphics and major label funding, was never going to stretch towards something that looked as good as Jurassic Park. The story It Sparkles and Everything from the Ramblings of a Madman 2 zine recounts the difficulty in even getting the video made. With Buggy involved on a major level, using the latest Apple and Silicon Graphics hardware, the vision was in place, but when outsiders were brought in there was some difficulty, especially as their main creative partner used a PC. This was the guy who created the video for Papua New Guinea for the Future Shock video release. Although they weren't so fond of the overall video, they were certainly impressed by the guy's vision. Either way, arguments ensued while the band looked on somewhat bewildered. Nevertheless, a conclusion drew near. There was a lot of ramble about unquantifiable wireframe menus, PCs versus Macs and budgets, most of it pretty amusing, but it culminates happily in PC scrotal sacs now merged perfectly with Silicon Spiky and the PC world merged effortlessly with Silicon. It's unsurprising to learn that Spiky was the main output of the Silicon graphics gear, given that he's rendered far better than any of the other imagery. In terms of actual content, Buggy's initial idea was apparently typically oblique, described amusingly as opening with wide-angle anal. In the end, more surreal but imaginative ideas came up, described by Garry with the usual wry cynicism as we'll go underwater and from a pod opening a giant seed will emerge, and from the hand of a dying man it'll travel up into the sky with giant scrotal sacs with a golden palace rotating in the distance. It's fair to say the graphics haven't aged all that well. They look very impressive for 1994, compare them to other music videos at the time and they create a pretty immersive world, but at the same time they're also very CG looking. Compared to the largely timeless music, they definitely fall down. To watch the video now is partially an exercise in nostalgia, although it's also enjoyable to see what they were trying to do. The potential in the imagery is wonderful and conjures up a strange imaginary world. Lifeforms AV opens with an alien swamp, trees and fungi growing, a fungus explodes, excreting spores. Underwater, a turtle and a ray swim over strange looking plants and a ball of light floats past. As Dead Skin Cells fades in, we see what is possibly the first silicon image, a morphing shape made of what looks like reflective liquid, texturally far more detailed than the landscape seen so far. A very unconvincing bird flies over a rocky landscape. So far, so abstract. Then Shawneen appears, arms stretched wide, and Spiky unfurls his tentacles. Spiky's far more fluid in his movements than previously seen on the Cascade video, and is the most impressively rendered model in the video. Then a headless figure appears and light radiates from its neck. We enter the Dead Man's Seed, Scrotal Sack and Golden Palace territory, and then final shots of Spiky and Shawneen come along, as well as a flying horse, and the landscape fades away. Lifeforms Path has a slightly different feeling, opening with black and white Super 8 footage of the band in and around the studio. This imagery is startling after the previous trippy 6 minutes. The video moves to quickly cut, and that means it should come with an epilepsy warning, footage of Shawneen, film of a forest, studio shots and CG landscapes. It's the only time where the video directly corresponds to the music, and it's possibly the best part, the fast-moving imagery adding to the disorientating nature of the track. More Super 8 footage and new CG polygons are interspersed throughout the remaining video, but the main material then repeats shots from Lifeforms AV, only with different colour gradients. When I first watched it, I was incredibly disappointed. This wasn't my Lifeforms. The odd, unwelcoming, almost claustrophobic alien landscapes, the computer imagery which had already looked dated a few years on. Having seen the My Kingdom video as an introduction to the band, I'd expected this to be the same live action footage with superimposed graphics. To this day, the visuals still seem somewhat detached from the music for me. It is still a work of remarkable imagination though, with a lot of striking and incredible imagery and a great inclusion of both Shawneen and Spiky. The video was advertised at the time as being a pilot for the forthcoming film Yage, and seen in that way it's quite successful. Bemoaning the fact that the people who are making the music haven't been the ones making the video, in The Wire, Garry was positing a future where high quality music videos, graphics and live music broadcasts could all exist side by side as a form of ultramedia. Acknowledging that the technology available at the time was both cost prohibitive and still too basic to fully represent the band's desired immersive world, Garry believed that when the new video technology comes down to an affordable level, street level, the kids are just going to wipe the floor with what the suits and the privileged creatives are doing with it. Although commonplace now, this democratisation of video was still many years in the future in '94, and so Lifeforms was simply a teaser for the kinds of things that could be created in the future, and on that level it's a definite success. The front and rear covers match the original album art. Lifeforms featuring Elizabeth Fraser. Release date 1st of August 1994. Intriguingly, the second single from Lifeforms was originally due to be released before the album. A dispute between Virgin and Liz Fraser's label at the time, Universal, ironically soon to be owners of Virgin, meant the single was put on hold indefinitely after initial plans for an early spring release fell through. A chance meeting in a pub between FSL's A&R man and a big player at Universal sorted things out, and the much delayed release eventually came out in August '94. What makes this so intriguing is how much further the band went with Lifeforms than Cascade. The album's first single was already dramatically reworked into a largely different track, but the single version of Lifeforms offered a completely different piece of music to the album's title track. It would have been pretty baffling to fans to buy an album only to find neither promotional single was actually on there. It's actually an odd release in general. Your typical FSOL multi-part single starts with the main version of the track as part 1 and then heads into a series of pieces closely or loosely based on it in a variations on a theme format. A radio edit sometimes appears at the end. Lifeforms does not do this. The album version appears as Path 3. What could be considered the single version, i.e. the one on the video, is Path 4. The radio edit is not in attendance. An alternate version of Lifeform Ends is Path 5, a remix of the single version is Path 6, and the remaining 3 paths are all heavily musically linked. Were it not for the presence of the album version, it could easily slot in after Little Brother, making Lifeforms a triple album. More than any of their other singles, Lifeforms really does feel like a mini-album in its own right. The album version, Path 3, was originally recorded, of course, in the Jumpin' and Pumpin' era as a Yage track called New Lifeforms, and featured frequently on the band's early radio transmissions. Intriguingly then, it was one of 2 tracks from this single to be sent over to the studio where Cocteau Twins singer Liz Fraser was to record vocals for the release. The band have spoken about rarely going back to rework old tracks, preferring to simply start them again and take them in new directions, hence the multipath single approach. So the idea to include Liz's vocals on the then very old album version feels strangely uncharacteristic. In typical FSOL fashion, the session didn't go quite to plan. The third Ramblings of a Madman zine features a lengthy story entitled Lifeforms, detailing the process, the key moment being the DAT player had recently taken to sporadically and randomly vomiting glitchy spikes where it deemed fit on recordings, and today was one such inopportune occasion. The album version was thus rendered unusable with countless horrendous and frequent overpowering glitches, but strangely it has ceased by the second version of the track. Thus the album version remains Liz-free. Her improvised, wordless vocals on the single version were taken, chopped up, resampled and restructured and used over the remaining 6 pieces on the single. Samplers at the time were of course limited to a few seconds per sample, meaning no extended moments of Liz's vocals feature on the release, and they appear in fragments, triggered and looped in the way the band's normal vocals appear. For Garry, a Cocteau Twins obsessive and Liz Fraser devotee, more than anyone needed to know about this and the Lifeforms story, this limitation ultimately led to the single being a disappointment. Over the years there have been brief mentions in interview of a new version of the single being made, utilising the versatility of computer software to allow Liz's vocals to be used in their entirety. Or, as Lifeforms more romantically puts it, to this day we're told Pin continues to work on them, working through the night without rest, but we're not sure if it'll ever be released or in fact if Pin will ever let go. With the Liz Fraser vocal takes belonging to Universal, any reissue would have to come out through the label rather than the band's own FSOL digital imprint, making it unlikely to be ever heard by the public. A short section performed during the group's ISDN transmission to Athens in 2009 remains the only known part, although it's quite possible that elements have now appeared on more recent Environments albums. Liz Fraser herself expressed disappointment, telling Boys magazine, "I sang my heart out for 11 fucking hours on that record, and all that is on it is something that sounds like a sample." I spoke to Brian about the issues surrounding the use of Fraser's voice, and he offered a different explanation. In fact, Gaz spent the whole day with Liz working on the vocals. After Gaz left Eel Pie Studios, Liz and her engineer compiled the vocals into one tape. The following day, a DAT tape was delivered to our studio with strict instructions to use exactly what had been provided, which is what we did. If it sounds sampled, it's because that's the way she compiled it. We were annoyed that we were restricted to the DAT provided. It might just have been her engineer. Whatever, strict instructions were given not to deviate from what was given. It seems then that regardless of the technological limitations of the time, either Fraser or her engineer prepared the individual vocal snippets intentionally. Quite why this happened and why Liz seemingly remembers it differently remains unknown. This use of a credited guest vocalist over an entire record remains unique in the band's catalogue. Garry told Music Technology in 1992 that we go for vocals that are part of the texture as an effect in the mix, not as someone being a spokesperson for a generation. A voice which isn't actually saying anything but just conveys emotion has more of a long-standing effect for me. Indeed, wordless sampled vocals appear on a significant number of FSOL tracks, usually female origin. Liz Fraser's versatile and powerful voice is used in much the same way on the single, her Scottish roots obscured by performances that sound closer to Asian and African styles. Along with sitar samples in Path 2 and the usual array of samples from the time, there are sounds from throughout the Lifeforms album in every track on the single. It runs closer to the ethno-tribal ambient sound than any other FSOL release. The general feel is somewhat darker and more percussive than the album, the first hints of the direction the band were taking after dipping their toes into the ambient pool throughout '93. Alongside the standard CD and 12-inch versions, a limited picture disc 7-inch was also released. The 7-inch includes 2 subtly different radio edits of Path 4, the first being the standard radio and video version. These 2 edits are joined by a further, even more ambient version on a promo CD, as well as, incongruously, the musically unrelated album mix. A promotional cassette features the radio edit, the full single, the album mix, and an extended radio version that is probably the one that remained unreleased until 2006's Teachings from the Electronic Brain compilation. Although if anybody has this promotional cassette and knows differently, do let me know. All versions feature the same buggy art, the shot of Shawneen from the Lifeforms gatefold, only with what looks like the crumbling remains of the jellyfish floating above, pushing up against a weird skin-like ceiling. The entire shot is rendered in brown and white. It's a strangely unsettling image, and one that matches the less ambient feel of the release. For the first time, the cover and spine list the band as FSOL rather than the Future Sound of London. A sticker adds with vocals by Elizabeth Fraser. She's also credited for co-writing the entire release, somewhat incorrectly in terms of Path 3. Talvin Singh is credited for Tablatronics, with no reference to which tracks he appears on. Amusingly, someone appears to have held the Shift key for too long when typing the EBV PO Box information on the promo CD sleeve listing the postcode as W!5ZL. The EBV logo is present alongside the 1970s Virgin logo, and they both appear on the disc, which features the same layout as the album CDs. The track's promotional video just recuts material from the Lifeforms VHS release, almost acting as a teaser for that video. The 12-inch features 2 run-out groove messages quoting movie dialogue sampled in their live transmissions. The man enlarged my mind, how did that happen? And swinging, mesmerised by the hopelessness of logic. The single was eventually released in August '94 and was very well received. It became their highest charting single at the time, reaching a high of number 14 in the UK Top 40 and spending 3 weeks in the Top 100, and its video was played on Top of the Pops. Its release also pushed renewed interest in the album, bringing it back into the Top 100 albums for a further 2 weeks. Part of the promotional campaign for the single was genuinely groundbreaking. Lifeforms was the first song ever commercially available on the internet as a download. An edit, in a very low bitrate form, was available through the Sonic Net website in June '94. Numerous acts have claimed the title before, but in 2017 FSOL were finally awarded the Guinness World Record for the first internet music download. During the summer holiday in '97, having previously purchased an imported version of the Cascade single on the basis of it being mentioned inside the Lifeforms sleeve, I went into my local independent record shop and asked if they could find out if there are any more FSOL singles I could back order. I'd been listening to the CDs I already had on repeat and wondered if there was any more FSOL to explore. They offered Expander, Lifeforms and The Far Out Son of Lung, and I put down a deposit for all 3. Expander came in first and was slightly disappointing, being a comparatively straightforward techno release. Turned out The Far Out Son of Lung was unavailable, but I did manage to get Lifeforms the following week. I remember taking the CD out of the bag before it even got out of the shop, looking at the track times and being baffled. The structure didn't remotely match that of their other singles. I put it on as soon as I got home, and Path 1 wasn't recognisable as anything to do with the Lifeforms I knew. I shouldn't have been surprised, everything the band did was unconventional. My initial impressions were of a prehistoric landscape, the earliest forms of life coming out of the sea and making tentative steps on land, the world being completely unrecognisable compared to the one we know. I was expecting an expansion to the grand vistas of the Lifeforms album and got something totally different. The opening and closing tracks I actually found quite scary. It quickly found its way on regular rotation, however. Over the years, I've probably returned to it less than the band's other multi-part singles, which is odd given how much original material it has on it. Must do something to rectify that. Lifeforms Path 1. The Lifeforms single begins with the weirdest sounds in the FSOL catalogue by this point. Strange whistling noises, muted tinkling bells, and what Garry would later refer to as some sloppy bathwater, recorded in Brian's bathroom, make up the first largely unmusical 70 seconds, remarkably strange for the band's then highest charting single. Eventually an oddly lolloping beat, complete with water splash loop, fades in accompanied by a single chord. This water drum loop would also be sampled around the same time by Union Jack and Another Fine Day. Whale calls, cawing birds, otherworldly rumblings and other sounds appear, and it isn't until 3.5 minutes before we finally hear Liz Fraser's chanting. Other than a couple of synth notes, there's nothing overtly electronic in the track, lending it an incredibly primitive tribal feel. The unidentified animal calls and slopping water are what always gave the piece a prehistoric feel to me, the soundtrack to life first emerging from the sea billions of years ago. It's an oddly subdued way to open a single, not in any way related to either the album or radio versions of Lifeforms, and reinforces the idea that this really is a mini-album in its own right rather than a traditional A-side, B-side single. As an overture to the record, it works very well. Several sounds are reused elsewhere throughout the single, such as a rapid tapping sample in the whale song featuring in Path 4, the main percussion loop appearing in Path 7, and the opening environment appearing on the 3 radio edits. The track was first broadcast on the 4th Kiss FM transmission. Lifeforms Path 2. There's a lot of sitar in Lifeforms Path 2. This is years before the amorphous androgynous psychedelic rock supergroup started using the instrument, and it acts as a precursor to that project's interest in Eastern music. There's also Eastern sounding violin in here, a sample that was first heard on the transmission exclusive version of Papua New Guinea. The track is a slow burn. There are plucked strings repeated throughout, a snippet of Liz Fraser's vocal, a sitar strum and some background sounds. It all loops around. Talvin sings tabla and a rumbling bass line joining in. The weird watery percussion sound from Little Brother and Tired even appears. The structure is different for F as well. Instead of chopping and changing between numerous sections, the track builds for 3 minutes. The main sitar melody appears, and then it returns to the building section, gradually throwing in more layers to reach a crescendo before the sitar melody reappears for the end. The structure feels surprisingly conventional by FSOL standards. Of course, there are so many layers of sounds and odd samples in the mix that there are always new things to listen to. As with Path 1, there's a lot of percussion in the track, which, along with Liz Fraser's chanted vocals, continues to suggest a somewhat tribal vibe to the music. As with the rest of the EP, there are numerous sounds reused throughout, including vocals later heard in Path 4 and Path 7, and percussion and whooping voices from Lifeform Ends. Lifeform's Path 3 is of course the album version, following the 2 more ethnic sounding opening pieces with a distinct change of pace. This single version closes with a bright, melodic closing environment that leads into Path 4, somewhat different to the disorienting, muffled barrage of steam trains and wailing voices that close the track on the album. On the single promo, the track is referred to as Album Mix and includes no outro environment. Lifeform's Path 4. Path 4 is what is generally considered the single version of Lifeforms, despite bearing almost nothing in common with the album version. There are a handful of samples, jungle sounds, warped human voices, and what sounds like an elephant. I'm pretty sure it's not, but I will always think of it as the elephant sound. That also appear in the album version, as well as its ambient cousin Ill Flower, but otherwise the 2 tracks are totally different pieces of music. There's a bold move to release them both under the same name, especially given the high profile of both the album and single. Garry compares the single version to the work of composer Michael Nyman, and there is a delicate minimalistic piano element to it that certainly has some similarities to some of Nyman's work. Liz Fraser's vocals are used more in this track than any other on the single, possibly because it's the one she originally sang along to. At times her voices are heavily layered, elsewhere she's left to sing solo and extensively, her vocals left to their original take without the time limitations of these samplers. While still veering through various sections, subtle differences occurring between bars, the piece uses its 9-minute runtime to introduce elements individually and build up to a crescendo, not too dissimilarly to Path 2. The rhythmic elements are less traditionally percussive than on most of the single, running closer to a breakbeat sound that makes the track almost danceable. Indeed, the combination of beats, piano, soaring vocals and synths makes the track the closest thing to Papua New Guinea since that very piece, so it's perhaps unsurprising it was chosen as a single and proved very successful. Other than the vocals, which of course are also used throughout the single, there are also bass sounds found in Lifeform Ends and a tapping noise from Cerebral used in the track. 2 tracks later, Path 6 acts as a brief reprise of this Path 4, and it was first broadcast at the start of the 3D Headspace Tour on the Mixing It show. Lifeform's Path 5. Path 5 opens with a sinister droning environment used on a number of transmissions and later on ISDN track Kai. After 40 seconds the mood becomes brighter and the track resolves itself into an alternate version of Lifeform Ends. While that piece builds with fast breakbeats and veers off into unrelated territory after a couple of minutes, Path 5 explores the theme more fully with slower rhythms and far more variation. Indeed, it's only this version of the track that appears in transmissions, first broadcast on the 5th Kiss FM transmission and appearing frequently afterwards. Interestingly, along with various inherent links with Ill Flower, the album version of Lifeforms, the track also includes a synth whoosh used on Expander Radio Remix. This seems amusingly fitting given that Lifeform Ends briefly uses drums from Accelerator's other single, Papua New Guinea. Lifeform's Path 6. Opening with a long field recording based environment, Path 6 is by far the most ambient piece on the Lifeform single. Effectively a reprise of Path 4, reusing the piano notes and light percussion from that track, it acts as a brief respite before the much darker closing path. The field recording and gentle feel give the track a nocturnal vibe. It shares a set of animal and human voice samples with Ill Flower and the album version of Lifeforms. Lifeform's Path 7. The Lifeform single closes with a fairly dark, slightly sinister and oddly amusing track. The combination of plucked and portamento violin that opens Path 7 used to make me laugh when I first heard it, and it still retains a certain humour to this day. There's just something about bendy sounds that's inherently funny. A single snippet of Liz Fraser's vocal is used throughout the track, alongside a choir synth and layers of percussion. The water drum loop from Path 1 returns here, bringing the single full circle, and the vocal and string elements also featured previously in Path 2, making the 3 tracks feel like a loose trilogy. At the end, Liz Fraser's voice fades away into a reverb on a strangely tense note, a dramatic and strangely unresolved closing environment that rounds out the whole Lifeforms era in a suitably bizarre manner. I used to find the track amusing, and that didn't quite sit right with me. Over time, however, it's become my favourite on the EP. The gloomy, surreal tone is utterly bizarre, and that makes it feel so completely FSOL. Lifeforms Radio Edit, also known as Lifeforms Radio Edit 1. The most severe radio edit in the group's history, cutting a 9-minute track down to less than 3. The crescendo-like structure is lost, but the most impressive section of the track is still present. By focusing on the beat-heavy part, the edit makes the track as commercially viable as possible. The brief outro includes sections of the intro environment to Path 1. Lifeforms Alternative Radio Edit, also known as Lifeforms Radio Edit 2. Structurally very similar to the main radio edit, the alternative radio edit replaces the heavier beats with a slow, light, reverby drum track exclusive to this version. It gives it a much more laid-back vibe. Unlike the main radio edit, the Path 1 environment sample occurs at the start, with the ending fading into reverb. Lifeforms Radio Edit 3. Structurally the same as the second radio edit, this promo-only track scales the rhythm back almost entirely, leaving the kick drum, looping metallic sound and tablas from the first half of the full-length track and making it a much more ambient version. Quite whether this track ever received radio play is unknown, but unlikely. The final two pieces from the era are both compilation exclusives. Bring Me Home, an exclusive track for the second of 3 21st anniversary budget price compilations Virgin Records put out in '94, Bring Me Home is an unusual track that feels much older than its release date. A chugging breakbeat, a wobbly voice singing the title, some synth chords and a jumping and pumping era sounding bird-like sample, it's pretty simplistic and lacking the subtlety of the Lifeforms era, suggesting it might have been left over from 1992. Interestingly, however, the title appears alongside a number of Lifeforms titles on an image in the most important moments of the Lifebook. One of the less interesting rarities in the band's catalogue, however. Deep into your subconscious I slide. The only place to hear the full-length version of this Lifeforms era track is the superb third volume in Astralworks' Excursions in Ambient series, also notable for being the only place to get Aphex Twin's Stone in Focus on CD for 30 years. Released in the US, many European listeners would have been limited to the brief edit of the track included as part of Lifeforms Path on the Lifeforms VHS release. A staggered drum loop, digital bleeps and an eerie synth melody back an Eastern sounding vocal melody and flute samples, making the track one of the most ethno-sounding pieces of the era and something that could very easily appear not only on the album but would have been comfortable on the Lifeforms Path single. Its omission on either one of these releases is a slightly puzzling one. Still, the appearance of this kind of compilation allows us to access the full version of this excellent track, for which we should be very grateful. It's first transmitted on the 1994 Essential Mix. While that rounds out the official promotional campaign for Lifeforms, it wasn't the only material released at this point. Indeed, Jumpin' and Pumpin' got involved with the release of the Expander single. Release date 18th of July 1994. Amidst all the Lifeforms hype, promotion and touring, Jumpin' and Pumpin' realised just what they lost when Brian and Garry jumped ship. And so, as is common with all thoroughly honest and decent record labels, they decided to cash in and put out Expander as a single. Garry's description on the old EBV website suggests it was something that had been discussed earlier. Jumpin' and Pumpin' wanted a second single from the Accelerator album. We were already out of there, having just inked a new deal with Virgin Records, and the single came alongside a proper reissue of said album, with new art and tracks from the band, so it seems like they're willing to go along with the release. In fact, instead of simply releasing a track straight from the album, they supplied the label with an unreleased remix. The album version of Expander doesn't appear on the single anywhere. On the B-side are an unreleased remix of Moscow and, slightly underwhelmingly, Central Industrial. Rounding out the release, the CD also includes a radio edit of the remix. Both remixes went on to feature on the Accelerator CD reissue, reducing the overall value of the package somewhat, although it's the only vinyl issue of the two tracks and the CD single the only place to find the edit. While the music might have been a fairly generous selection put together by the band, the artwork is a different matter. The front cover features overlaid photographs of the group, both looking incredibly young judging by their hair, with some very tasteless typography on top. The FSOL logo is particularly nasty, the kind of thing one would expect from a budget dance compilation, although by this point that was the bulk of Jumpin' and Pumpin's output. The The font used for the main text and the fact that there's a band shot on the front are dead giveaways that Boogie went nowhere near this release. There's little of interest in the sleeve, with no EBV or Earthbeat logos present, although the release is notable for being the band's first on Passion Music not to credit Garry with the birth spelling of his surname. A second vinyl pressing came in a generic jumpin' and pumpin' sleeve. Despite Expander already being stylistically dated and sounding absolutely nothing like the ambient music Virgin were pushing under the FSOL name, the single still managed to sell better than the bulk of the label's releases, reaching number 72 in the UK charts on the 30th of July 94, and spending 2 weeks inside the top 100. Expander Radio Remix. The CD version of the Expander single features the typical radio edit, albeit an edit of the remix version. Structurally, as with many of the group's radio edits, the track retains the structure of the full-length version. Indeed, given that this edit only removes a minute from the track, the bulk of the two are identical, just 30 seconds from the beginning, and around the same amount from about 3:20 into the main track are removed. It's possible the radio edit received some airplay at the time, given the amount of attention the band were receiving, and the fact the single sold enough to chart in the top 75, but it's unlikely to have been one of the most widely played radio cuts in their career. Expander Remix. The remix of Expander, although not commercially available until the release of a single in July 94, was first heard in 1992, both as the basis of the track on the band's first Peel session and as exclusive material on the first Kiss FM test transmission. Other than lacking the acid squelches, the remix is identical to the album version for the first 30 seconds, and then only a slightly different breakbeat separates the two. It's around the minute mark when the two diverge dramatically, with an entirely new melody coming in, one that's a lot more dramatic and techno-sounding than the quirky, squelchy tune of the original. Makes the remix sound like a darker and more serious piece of music, the lighter, more playful side of the original removed. Retaining the vocal sample and 5-note loop of the original, the bulk of the track is otherwise entirely new. The outro reunites it with the original version somewhat. I always preferred this remix to the original, and I'm not sure if it's because I heard it first or it's a preference for the slightly darker, more technoid sounding track in general. It's probably a mix of the two. Either way, the direct, more repetitive melody and removal of the stranger, more playful tune makes it more likely to be a suitable single, and it's clear why it was chosen. Moscow Remix. Electronic musicians occasionally have a habit of remixing their own tracks so much that they no longer sound anything like the originals. Underworld are an excellent example of this. Compare Tin There to Pearl's Girl. They also sometimes like putting out totally unrelated pieces of music under the guise of remixes. I'm looking at you, Aphex. So which is Moscow Remix? After many years of listening, I'm yet to hear even a hint of anything from the original Moscow, other than them being in the same tempo. The spy theme feel of the original is gone, being replaced by a doom-laden, pounding techno track complete with church bell samples and horror film screams. It's a relatively straightforward piece for the band, lacking the structural diversions and layers of weird samples that normally give an FSOL track its unique identity. But at the same time, it does its own simplistic job incredibly well, and it's one of my favourite Accelerator era pieces. I just don't hear any relation to the original in there. Accelerator 1994. This is the version of Accelerator that I first bought. It's the one that was in my local indie alongside the group's Virgin albums. It was the only version in print for a long time, so for me it remains the proper version of the album. Coinciding with the release of the Expander single in 94, Jumpin' and Pumpin' decided to reissue Accelerator. Expanded in both music and visuals, the 1994 reissue did a reasonable job of aligning the album with the group's Virgin catalogue. Principally, other than the front cover, only given a subtle change in the title bars, all the artwork in this release is new, including the general use of Euro style expanded by then the standard FSOL font. Used on the back cover and spine of the CD, as well as an alternative cover on the back of the booklet, the font adds a sense of uniformity and continuity with the bulk of the Virgin catalogue. As an aside, I always preferred the cover on the back cover of the booklet, maybe because of the use of the font, and I used to replace the booklet this way round in my local record shop. The eagle-eyed staff always managed to spot it and put it back to normal before my next visit. Thankfully, there's no revisionism here, with the extra booklet pages containing period graphics, largely variations on the explosive style of the cover image, as well as an amusing shot of Brian and Garry in sunglasses. In fact, the art's so utterly in keeping with the era, and totally different to the later designs, that I never guessed that the package wasn't put together in 1992 for quite a long time. It's fairly recently that somebody on Discogs pointed out that the manufacturing credits on the disc itself must make it at least a 1994 release, and then it was deciphered that this was actually released alongside the Expander single. But in terms of the art, it's only really the appearance of the EBV logo that gives things away. There's an advert for the Earthbeat compilation labelled also available from the Earthbeat Studios, and cheekily no PO box address for the band but one for Jumpin' and Pumpin' instead. Boogie is amusingly credited as Mr. BG Riphead. It's not known whether the Expander and Moscow remixes were intended just for release on either the single or the album, or whether the doubling up was part of the band's idea, but it's hard to know how sales were affected by this. However, purchases of both CDs just seem somewhat pointless. With an already lengthy 52-minute runtime, no bonus tracks were added to the vinyl repress, but the reissue artwork is exclusive, a blend of the original and updated CD versions. The back cover is identical to the original release. And with that, the Lifeforms era was well and truly over. This is a period that started way back in September 92 really, with the first Kiss FM test transmission, a broadcast opening with the title track of Lifeforms, and its sound was developed, gradually being updated over the course of the 8 Kiss transmissions, the 3D Headspace Tour, the Lifeforms album, and of course the Cascade and Lifeforms singles. By August 94, things were almost unrecognisable from when the group first signed to Virgin, and it was clear that their sound and approach was moving on. But there'll be more on that next time as we open up the beginning of the ISDN album era. In the meantime, please do leave me comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the tracks and releases and broadcasts mentioned here, especially if you're there at the time. I'd love to hear them. And there are like, share and subscribe buttons you might also like to press. And I hope to see you next time.